Yep.
Okay. All right, guys. I know this is you guys have met me before, but a lot of the folks at Outline Schools have not. So I'll introduce myself and tell you a little bit about my background. I'm Lieutenant Colonel DeKemper. I'm the second of two officers who work here at the detachment here at Prescott High School. My purpose today is to introduce myself, tell you a little bit more about my career, so you have a little better idea of where I'm coming from. And then 2 more lessons later this week, I'm going to be teaching you about the missile career field and also some stuff about the intelligence career field, specifically arms control, because that's where I spent several years of my time in the Air Force doing arms control work. Does anybody know what I mean by arms control? Control of arms. What do I mean? We're not talking about these kind of arms, are we? When we talk about arms, what are we talking about?
Weapons.
Cadet McGee.
Didn't you specify like nuclear weapons?
I'm sorry, say again?
Did you specify nuclear weapons?
I did work with nuclear weapons, and when I did arms control work, we were actually doing arms control treaty inspections, and we were checking nuclear weapons, the organization that I worked with. There are other parts of the organization I worked with, it's called the On-Site Inspection Agency. They were doing conventional arms, which are like tanks and, you know, big artillery and those kind of things. But the stuff that we were doing had to do with nuclear missiles. Okay. All right, let me tell you a little bit more about myself, and then like I say, we'll get into some of those. I grew up in Kansas and Arizona, primarily. I am the son of a Navy sailor, and my father passed away when I was young, and so I went to live with my uncle, who was an Air Force Master Sergeant. And so I spent a little bit of time kind of in a non-military world and some time in the military world. And then as I got older, I decided to join the military myself. I graduated from high school down in Tempe at Marcos High School, if anybody's familiar with the Valley. And then I went to college at ASU, and I was in college ROTC. Does anybody know the difference between college ROTC and junior ROTC?
College is more ranked and a little more strict, sir.
Okay, they use similar ranks to you. They use cadet rank. It looks very similar to yours. They use the same titles, but it is more strict because they have a different purpose. Anybody else want to add something to it?
Train them for when they actually do go into the military and become officers.
Okay, exactly. You guys don't have to go in the military. You guys may be interested in the military, but you could be in JROTC for 1, 2, 3, 4 years and decide, I'm not interested in the military, and walk away and go do something else. The cadets who are in college ROTC, they can usually try it out for a year or 2, but if they come back and start their junior year, or if they're on a scholarship, they have to go in the military. So they're actually being trained to be military officers. Did you want to add something, Cadet Pekovich? Okay. So I went through ROTC in the early 1980s. I graduated from ASU in 1983. And then I was commissioned as a second lieutenant and went in the Air Force. My commitment was for 4 years, and as you can tell, I stayed a lot longer now because I have, if I had got out 4 years, I would have been a captain, and I retired as a lieutenant colonel, so obviously I stuck around that long. Come on in, Cadet. I stayed in actually 21 years, and I did a wide variety of stuff, and I'll tell you more about that now, but even in more detail tomorrow. My first career field was in the space and missile career field. Anybody have any idea what that means?
You load missiles onto jets, sir.
Okay, it could be, but not the part that I was in. The space and missile world is different. What you're talking about is munitions handlers, and those guys are loading bombs on aircraft, but they're not in the space and missile world that I'm talking about. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Think about the technical part of the Air Force. We're a very technical service. When I say space, what does that imply? Satellites, you're exactly right. In the space part of the Air Force, those are the guys that are flying satellites. We have a wide variety of satellites that do a lot of different things. Most people think that, oh, satellites just take some pictures or whatever, right? But there's a lot of different kinds of satellites. Can you think of some of the different kinds of satellites, different missions they might do?
The Hubble.
Okay, that one is actually a scientific satellite, and it is looking out into space with a telescope, right? What else?
Missile satellites.
Missile satellite, what do you mean by that?
Aren't there some satellites that have missiles loaded on them in case we need to shoot somebody?
Only in the James Bond films.
No.
No, we don't have those, but we do have what we call missile detection satellites, and they're basically satellites that hover over areas that we might be concerned about somebody shooting a missile at us. And if something takes off, you can imagine, when a missile takes off, there's a big, huge explosion, a big burn, right? Puts off a lot of heat, and you can see that from space really easily. And so, yes, in fact, we do have some satellites that look for those kinds of things to tell us, hey, something just took off in this area. You better be tracking it. What other things might satellites do for you?
GPS.
GPS. If you've got a GPS in your car or on your phone, that's all working off of military satellites. Okay? They used to be very inaccurate. Do you know why they were so inaccurate?
The technology was always good.
Actually, the technology was pretty good. It's not as good as it is now, but it was still much better than what you could receive. We actually degraded the signal, and the military degraded the signal. So if you had a civilian GPS, it would tell you the kind of the general area, but not right down to the the
Why, sir?
1 meter, because we didn't want our enemies to be able to use it against us, right? So we had access to encrypted GPS, which told us right down to the spot where we're at, and civilians had access to a degraded version. But a few years back, we took those requirements off, and now you guys can get just as good as what we're getting. What's that?
I was gonna say, what if someone had one of those encrypted GPS back of that?
Then they would have access, as long as they have current encryption and all that kind of stuff, you'd have access to the best of
Would that have been bad, sir?
Well, it wouldn't have been good.
If they were caught, would
Yeah.
they gotten like federal prison time?
Well, a civilian just wouldn't have that kind of stuff typically, but yeah, if you stole it or something, sure, you'd be in trouble.
Just like pick it up.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Okay, what about some other things that we do with satellites?
Missile radio.
Communications, right? There are some cell phones that use satellites, but we use them for communications. Like if you want to call somebody halfway around the world, it's a good chance that the signal is going to go from your cell phone to a cell tower through the phone system somewhere and then be beamed up into space, and then it's passed from one satellite to the next and then down in Asia or Europe or wherever you're talking. There are wires too, but there's a lot of stuff going.
Is
Yes,
this Sputnik satellite too, sir?
Sputnik was a satellite, was the original satellite put up by what country?
Russia.
Yeah, the Russians, or as they were known then as the Soviet Union, right? The Soviets put it up in the 1950s, and Sputnik was basically designed to do what?
Just beep.
All it did was beep pretty much, and every few seconds you hear beep, beep, and we freaked out, But why would we freak out over something that really isn't doing much other than circling
Space
here?
race.
They did it first.
Okay, they were the first to do it, and if you could put that satellite up, you might be able to put other stuff up into space too, right? So satellites, starting in the 1950s, were new and unknown. Now we have satellites, all kinds of satellites, and we use them all the time in ways that you don't even think about with communications and all that. But our world will be a very different place without satellites. Yes, sir.
Who do you think won or is winning the space race, or us or Russia? Soviet.
Well, I guess the only thing I can say right now is that we don't have we don't have as much presence as we used to have without the space shuttle and some of those things. The Russians are obviously still putting people up there.
Oh, so we're
actually
still racing.
Well, we're actually paying the Russians to put our guys in space to the International Space Station.
So I think they might be winning.
So it just depends. But I mean, there's a lot of ways you put things in space using more missiles and all kinds of things. But anyway, back to what we're talking about. The space part of the Air Force is a big, big thing. It has grown tremendously in the last 30 or 40 years because of all the advances in space and satellites. The part that I was in, which you can see on my badge here, is the missile part, space and missiles. The missile part are the intercontinental ballistic missiles. Does anybody know what that is?
Non-ballistic missiles.
What's the name tell you? Intercontinental means what?
From one
They can go from one continent to the other.
That's right. Inter means from one to the other, right? Or from outside one area to another. So intercontinental means that it will fly from one continent to another. Ballistic means, anybody know?
explosive.
What's that?
Isn't it?
Ballistic means that a ballistic trajectory means, like a bullet uses a ballistic trajectory. For those who have fired a gun, if this is a bullet, it comes out of the barrel. The energy that it has as it comes out of the barrel, does that increase or decrease as it goes through flight?
Decreases, sir.
It decreases, right? The only energy on that bullet is what was fired originally, and then the rest of the time it is just slowly slowing down, right? Unless it hits something. But eventually, what will it do?
Drop.
It eventually will drop and it will hit the ground because gravity will pull it down, right? It's the same thing with missiles. Missiles, typically, the type that I used, they had 3 stages that would basically throw them into space, and after that, it was the inertia, that just like a bullet that came out. They would use their inertia to basically go to where they're going to, and they could guide themselves.
Kind of like on Mission Impossible 4.
I don't know, what happened to Mission Impossible 4?
They launched a nuclear weapon into the earth, into the air.
Oh, and that's right, it was on its way back in. Yes, it got fired up into space, and then once the last stage fired, the rest of that was just inertia as it was flying through the air. So intercontinental ballistic missile basically works that way. All right, and I'm going to give you a lot more detail tomorrow. I went through, after I commissioned as a second lieutenant, I went through training on how to fire the missiles. Our job was to maintain them, and then also how to launch them, if that should ever be the case. Unfortunately, it hasn't. But I went through Vandenberg Air Force Base, some training out in Vandenberg for several months, and then my first duty station was up in Grand Forks, North Dakota, where I was a missile launch officer for several years. And it was our job. I was the guy that you see in the movies that, that goes down underground, and they're like, everybody else says, you're waiting there with a button, a phone and a button. It's not quite like that. I'll show you some pictures tomorrow. But it is a key. It's a key that looks not unlike a car key. You could take any one of these just regular old keys, and it doesn't look much different than that. So it is a key, and there's a lot more communications because it's all about being able to communicate with our president and people in charge of our military. So anyway, I did that for 4 years, and then at the conclusion of my time in the missile world, I was selected by the Air Force to go back to school, and they sent me to graduate school, and they sent me for 2 years out to Monterey, California, which, has anybody ever been to Monterey? Do you remember much about it?
Yeah, I just went there.
Oh, you were just there?
Yeah.
It's a really terrible place to live, isn't it? It's right on the beach. It's cool year-round. It's never super cold. It's never super hot. It is just an absolutely gorgeous place, and they've got whales and all kinds of stuff that migrate through the area. We actually lived in Navy housing. I could get up in the morning, I could hear the sea lions barking down in the water, probably about a quarter mile away. And yeah, I'd look out my window and I'd pinch myself and think, I'm getting paid to go to school here? You're not kidding me. So anyway, I spent a year there going through academics to basically get a master's degree in Soviet East European Studies. And so it was a lot of courses on history, economics, demographics, and basically the Soviet Union and countries of Eastern Europe. We had a big focus on those countries in the 1980s because that was part of the Cold War. And so we were training a lot of people to be experts on that part of the world because we expected to ultimately have to fight them. And so I graduated in 1990 after a year of academics, and then they sent me through a year of language school to learn to speak Russian. And then what did the Soviet Union do about a year and a half after I graduated? I graduated in the summer of 1990, and in December of 1991, the Soviet Union did what? No, that was back in the 60s.
Became Russia?
Yeah, they collapsed. The Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1990. For a short period of time, they tried to stay together in what they called the Commonwealth of the United States. That didn't work very long. Within a few months, the different republics, there were 15 republics like states in the United States, 15 different republics declared their independence and became independent countries. You've probably heard of a lot of them, like Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, they kind of fell apart, and it doesn't mean that the stuff I learned was useless. It just wasn't as much of a focus as we used to have. Everything was about the Cold War, about the United States against the Soviets. And the world became much more bipolar, multipolar. It was bipolar in the sense that the Soviets are on one side, Americans on the other. That's bi, right? Multipolar means what? Lots of different threats out there, right? It's not just the Soviets and now the Russians that anybody's worried about. Now people are looking at countries all over the world. And of course we have terrorists and others that we're dealing with too. So the world has become more complex in many ways since then. After I went to graduate school, the Air Force decided, hey, missiles isn't a great fit for me anymore because of my education, so they decided I was going to become an intelligence officer. So I got sent to intelligence school, and I've got this Russian background. I've got a master's degree in Soviet East European Studies. I go to Intel school, and where do you think they sent me?
Russia.
You would think so, right? That would be the most obvious place to send a guy like me. They sent me to Korea. Actually, I called the guy up and I was talking to him, and I said, where are you gonna send me? He says, well, I got a job in Korea, or I got a job in Panama. And I said, well, I speak Russian. And he goes, yeah. And I said, so doesn't it make more sense to send me to Russia? And he goes, well, if I had a slot in Russia, I'd send you, but I got a slot in Korea or Panama. Which one do you want? And I asked him, I said, well, what's the job in Panama? He says, I can't tell you, it's classified.
Oh, that's so
And then he said, the only thing I can tell you is you got to go to jump school before you go to it. And so, in my mind, what I'm thinking of is, okay, this is going to be anti-drug work probably, right? And you know, when you're going after guys and drugs, they don't mind about shooting. I mean, they'll shoot first and ask questions later, right? And I had this image of some big monster army guy like grabbing me by the straps in the back of some airplane, going, "You ready to jump?" Throwing me out of the airplane. And by then I was like 30 and had 2 kids and the whole bit. And I thought, you know what? If I was 22 and single, I would definitely take that job. And I thought, tell me more about Korea. I hear it's nice.
At least you got it. At least you got
You
it.
should have taken it.
Yeah, I did have a choice. I had A or B. So anyway, they sent me to Korea. We actually went to Yongsan Army installation. I lived with the Army for several years over there. And it was the headquarters for the U.S. forces in Korea, all the U.S. forces that are over there. And I got to work at an army base right in the middle of downtown Seoul, which is a city of like 13 million people or something.
You ever thought what your life would be like if you